Hello everyone, it's Mark Goodacre here. Welcome to the NT Pod, the podcast all about the New Testament and Christian origins. It's extended episode 6, and today we're going to be listening to a lecture on myths of Mary and the married Jesus. This is a recording of a lecture that I gave in the University of Birmingham in England, my former stomping ground, where I worked happily for 10 years, from 1995 to 2005. And I was invited back there in January 2013 to deliver one of the Cadbury Lectures, and the general theme for these Cadbury Lectures was religion out of the box, dialogue with the academy, society and culture. And my talk was about the intersection between popular culture and how it impacts on scholarship on the specific issue of Jesus and his marriage to Mary Magdalene, or not, as the case may be. It's about 48-50 minutes long, and this is a recording in front of an audience, so you'll hear sort of audience reactions and so on as well. So a slightly different experience from the usual shorter NT pods, but I hope you'll enjoy listening nevertheless. If you would actually like to watch it with pictures too, you can actually see the thing on YouTube. Just Google for Mark Goodacre Cadbury Lecture 2013, something like that, and you should be able to find it. Okay, hope you enjoyed the lecture. I'll stop rabbiting on because you'll be hearing lots more from me quite shortly. Thanks a lot. The talk, in a way, is a little bit risky. The title is a little bit risky, to talk about myths of Mary and the married Jesus, because the term myth is understood well by lots of scholars of religion, including lots of people in this department. And so it's a little bit cheeky of me to use a term like myth when I'm presenting something here in Birmingham. But the reason isn't just that I like alliteration, like lots of people. So myths of Mary and the married Jesus, it kind of suggested itself to me, and I couldn't resist calling it that. But it's also that there's a Birmingham pedigree for myth, and myth when it comes to the question of popular culture, at least the way that academics sometimes will pitch into the public sphere. And one of the most famous examples of this is the myth of God incarnate from 1977. And it's quite sad that John Hick, who edited that volume, isn't here with us any longer, died last year. And also Michael Golder, one of the contributors to it, died 3 years ago. And he edited the follow-up volume that you see on the right there, Incarnation and Myth, the Debate Continued, which arose out of a kind of discussion within the university itself. And I did want to mention those great luminaries of Birmingham, especially Michael Golder, who I did some of my doctoral work on, and it's good to have his widow Claire with us today. Very warm welcome to her too. But the particular piece of interesting popular level work that I want to begin with is the discovery recently, as recent as September 2012, of something that's called the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. And it is something that Karen King from Harvard Divinity School announced in September with a coordinated media campaign. What she did is she had 3 mainstream US newspapers all report on this, a major website, and a documentary on Smithsonian channels planned as well for 2 weeks later. And the whole thing was coordinated so that it would be a big splash in September of last year. What Karen King announced was a tiny piece of papyrus, which she thinks dates from the 4th century, the early 4th century. It's written in Coptic, which is a kind of form of ancient Egyptian, using Greek letters and 1 or 2 other letters, and it really is quite tiny, and that illustrates how small it is in the picture, and that's Karen King herself there holding it. What the papyrus actually looks like is this. This is one of the pictures from the Harvard Divinity School website. And the papyrus is remarkable because of the words that it contains. In particular, one word, ta-hima, which is Coptic for my wife. And so what we have here is Jesus says, my wife. That's the close-up of it, ta-hima. There's no mistaking it. It's quite clearly there in the text, almost suspiciously in bold, saying, ta-hima, my wife. And Of course, if you discover a piece of papyrus that talks about Jesus' wife, one of the first things you might think is, well, what if you've got a metaphorical wife here? What if it's Jesus talking about the church? But it doesn't seem to be, because one of the other words here very clearly is Mariam, which you can see there, Mary. And again, very clearly represented on manuscript. And so that there's no doubt about the kind of marriage we're talking about, we also have the line at the bottom of the manuscript, I live with her, as if to make quite clear that this is the kind of marriage that includes carnal relations. So quite a sensational manuscript discovery. Suddenly we have a text from the ancient world that unambiguously depicts Jesus being married to Mary Magdalene. Now, any discovery like this, one of the first things you want to do is find out what other people think about it and see if it could be corroborated by other scholars. Karen King went to one of her former students, Anne-Marie Lyondike from Princeton, and also a top international papyrologist, Roger Bagnall from Columbia University, both of whom felt that this was a genuine piece of ancient text. The worry about it, though, was that the document was unprovenanced, like a lot of sensational discoveries, like the James Ossery discovery in 2002. There's no sign anywhere of where this came from. We don't know where it emerged from. And the person who brought it to Karen King is apparently a kind of tall, dark stranger, an enigmatic sort of figure. He does not wish to be named, so he's refused to be named. And Karen King has stood by that and hasn't named the person that brought it along. So that makes it a little difficult. He apparently brought with it a couple of letters from the early 1980s from Berlin Free University, which coincidentally is somewhere that Karen King herself studied in the early 1980s. But those letters haven't themselves been published. Now, one of the things that makes this discovery so fascinating is that it speaks right into what one might want to call the zeitgeist. Because since 2006 at least, and arguably since 2003, the Da Vinci Code has been in the popular mindset. It's been in the popular consciousness. The film itself, a big Hollywood blockbuster, was released in 2006, and the book on which it was based was released in 2003. It's a piece of historical fiction, and some scholars would say that the fiction bit is more appropriate than the historical bit. And what tends to happen with this sort of thing is that you get a reaction. You get a reaction amongst these scholars. And there's been a small cottage industry since the Da Vinci Code came out of scholars publishing books refuting the Da Vinci Code, including top scholars like Bart Ehrman from down the road from me in North Carolina. We've got evangelicals like Ben Witherington III, and so on. So several scholars that have pitched into all of this to make their objections to the Da Vinci Code clear. But if the scholars were clear that there's nothing in Dan Brown's historical fiction in which Jesus has a wife, Mary Magdalene, and they give birth to a kind of a bloodline that is effectively the Holy Grail, that and it's this dynasty that will go on after Jesus and Mary Magdalene have been married. If the scholars were kind of busy refuting this, it didn't actually filter its way into that public consciousness which was ready for this idea of Jesus having a wife. And there's a contrast here, I think, between the recent history of this discovery and material that goes back to the 1980s. Because one of the older big public scandals or big public events in this area was the release of the film in 1988, The Last Temptation of Christ, Martin Scorsese's directing. And The Last Temptation of Christ is based on a book by Nikos Kazantzakis, a Greek author who wrote in 1953 and published it in 1960. And the reason that it's of interest is that it features Mary Magdalene in the film having sex with Jesus. It was a big scandal at the time. I remember, as an undergraduate student in Oxford at the time, going along to see it at the cinema there, and I had to cross a picket line of Christians who didn't want anyone to be going in. In fact, I knew several of the people on the picket line, and they thought I'd come to join the picket. They were a bit disappointed when I walked through. Said, no, I was quite excited about seeing it. But the film itself caused a stir because it actually depicted Jesus having sex with Mary Magdalene. In the shot that you can see here, this is Barbara Hershey that plays Mary Magdalene. You see her earlier in the film in the role of the prostitute who is gazed at by Jesus. So Jesus looks at her having sex with other men, and that idea is already then planted in his head at that point. And it's very clear in the film, there is no doubt about it, that this Mary Magdalene is a prostitute. The relationship that Jesus has with her, though, isn't a real relationship. It's not the relationship of a man and his wife. What it is, it's a fantasy in Jesus' head. Because the nub of the film is the last 20 to 30 minutes where Jesus has his last temptation while he's on the cross. What happens is that the young angel comes and tells Jesus to get down from the cross. This is the British actress that plays the young angel. It's interesting that she's played by a white British actress. The book actually has an Arab boy doing this role, so it's a change. And what happens is, she leads Jesus and shows him the life that he could have, so that he's tempted to come down from the cross and live that life that he would have loved to have lived. And I haven't actually given you the most, shall we say, the most salacious of these shots. It is actually reasonably tastefully done, the piece. But when I was putting together this PowerPoint presentation, I thought I'll have to find the most tasteful shot I can, and this is the most tasteful shot that I can find. This is Jesus, played by Willem Dafoe, Mary Magdalene, played by Barbara Hershey. My wife wondered what was going on when I was repeatedly playing the same piece, which appeared to be some kind of piece of soft pornography, and repeatedly freezing it on particular bits to see how it looked. And I did assure it was actually part of my research for a paper that I was planning to give in England. So this is Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Now, what we see there is no hint in the last temptation of Christ that Jesus is married to Mary Magdalene. At this point, he is still thinking of this as something which is a fantasy. It's not something which is yet has become a sort of piece of Jesus' life, the real historical Jesus' life. And in this, the last temptation of Christ is already part of a kind of popular culture kind of trajectory that has Jesus and Mary Magdalene and questions about their relationship with one another. Karen mentioned that her favourite Jesus film is Jesus Christ Superstar, probably mine too. I love Jesus Christ Superstar for all the corny lines, for all the terrible theology. There's something that's quite compelling about it. And one of the things that is compelling about it, especially in the film version from 1973, which David Green directed, is Yvonne Elliman plays Mary Magdalene, and you see her there singing to Jesus. And one of her famous songs is, "I don't know how to love him. I've been with so many men before, in very many ways, he's just one more." So she's worrying about how to have this relationship with Jesus. She's used to having a sexual relationship with a man, and now how does she react to Jesus? And that's one of the hearts of the film of Jesus Christ Superstar. What a lot of people don't know is that Mary Magdalene in the Swedish stage show version of the film was played by Agneta Fältskog. And if you don't know who she is the blonde A from ABBA. And it's a little thing that I sometimes challenge myself to do to see if I can find a way of getting ABBA somehow into a presentation about Jesus. And then on this occasion it was quite easy because I was talking about Mary Magdalene. The extraordinary thing is that's the Swedish single of I Don't Know How to Love Him. The extraordinary thing is, when you look at her, you could hardly get further from the depiction of Mary Magdalene in almost every other Jesus film to have a Swedish blonde playing the character. But it's worth chasing down. I do have the single, and it is an amazing version. It's quite a gorgeous version. But like I say, this does take us a long way from what Jesus and Mary Magdalene might have looked like. There's a paper in the USA which this is taken from. As you're picking up your groceries, you often see this Weekly Standard, and it has it's usually Elvis having appeared to someone again, and this occasion it was Jesus had a wife and she looked like opera. So we've gone a little bit away from the issue at hand. So let's return to the question of Jesus' wife, and let's look at the context for this recent apparent discovery of the gospel of Jesus' wife. It was a really big issue, really big news story in the US. It was on all the major TV channels. It was covered all over the internet. It was in all the major newspapers. It became a really big story. And Karen King, who's one of the most, and I need to say that she is one of the most respected scholars of early Christianity that there is. She's a stellar scholar. Her work is fantastic, and anything that I say about the fragment shouldn't in any way be taken as a criticism of her or of her work. I think that she does fantastic work. So back to the fragment, the Jesus wife fragment. There we see it in close-up. Now, I began to worry, along with one or two other people, when we stared at this fragment, because the more you stare at it, the more you notice problems and anomalies in connection with it. One of the real issues with this is that every single line of the fragment has a parallel in the Coptic Gospel of Thomas. Every single line. Which means that it's unlike any other fragment of papyrus from antiquity. Every line has a parallel. And this is peculiar because the parallels are in Coptic. The Gospel of Thomas was not written in Coptic. It was composed in Greek, and we have Greek fragments of it. I think it's composed in Greek. So when we see these really close parallels between the Coptic Gospel of Thomas and the Coptic Gospel of Jesus' wife, we've really only got two major options. One option is that in antiquity, in the 4th century, somebody got hold of the Coptic Gospel of Thomas and created the Gospel of Jesus' wife. The second possibility is that a modern person got hold of the Gospel of Thomas in Coptic and copied it out. Now, the reason it's much more plausible to believe that a modern person's done that is because the Gospel of Thomas in Coptic hasn't been around all of those years. It basically went into a jar in the ground in the 4th century, where it lay until 1945. So the fact that this fragment looks so similar to pieces of the Coptic Gospel of Thomas is suspicious. It becomes much more likely that a forger has taken lines from a modern edition of the Gospel of Thomas than that someone in antiquity has done this. Not least because now there are multiple editions of the Gospel of Thomas. It's very, very easy to find copies of the Gospel of Thomas, including on the internet. Now, this would just be speculation, except for the fact that there are certain things about the Jesus wife fragment and the Gospel of Thomas that are strikingly similar, worryingly similar, we might say. One of them is that the line breaks between the Coptic Gospel of Thomas and the Jesus wife fragment are often the same. And this includes right in the middle of words. So I've circled here the top left-hand side of the papyrus fragment, where you have exactly the same wording as you have in the Gospel of Thomas. I've circled the piece at the bottom there, where you have exactly the same piece broken off in the middle of a word. And I'll give it you a little bit closer up. You can see that phrase, and it's basically in English, to me, full stop, for my mother. That's roughly how it goes. The idea that this is not something which has been copied from the Coptic Gospel of Thomas that we have seems unlikely. Furthermore, I think we can go a little further and say it's not just that the person in question has copied it from a particular, from the Coptic Gospel of Thomas in general. He's copied it from a particular version of the Coptic Gospel of Thomas. And it's an internet version, which is, of course, available as widely as the internet's available. It's written by a friend of mine, well, I've got to know him through this business, called Michael Grondin. It's called An Interlinear Coptic English Translation of the Gospel of Thomas. And it looks like the person that has produced the Gospel of Jesus' wife is dependent specifically on this internet edition, this internet interlinear. This is what the text looks like when you go to it on the web. You have a line of Coptic and a line of English. If you were, let's say, a forger that didn't know very much Coptic, and let's say that you wanted to find a way of quickly and easily stringing together some Coptic phrases, an interlinear like this would be a godsend. And I think it's a godsend that a forger has actually used, because when Mike Grondin put together this interlinear version of the Gospel of Thomas, he missed out a letter on one of the lines. He missed out the letter mu, which is like the letter M. Now, the letter mu is important because it's the marker in Coptic here of the direct object. So, what we have in the Gospel of Jesus' wife and in Mike Grondin's interlinear Gospel of Thomas is the same missing letter at exactly the same point, the missing mu. I remember where I was when I spotted this. I was sitting in a pub in Raleigh, near where I live, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. At the same time, somebody else noticed it, Andrew Bernhard, who published it, and he asked if I would mind if he went ahead, and I said that was absolutely fine. But I think that this amounts to a kind of smoking gun. I think that the likelihood that by coincidence this fragment would happen to have exactly that typo at exactly that place, given that there are all these other similarities between Coptic Thomas and between the Gospel of Jesus' wife, it makes it very likely that what we're looking at here is not, sadly, a 4th century fragment, but is in fact a modern forgery. Now, I've been making some of these views known on my blog, and I've had some criticism for it. Some people think that this amounts to some kind of vendetta against Karen King, or it amounts to irresponsible scholarship and so on. But I don't think so. I think that actually what we're talking about here is something which is responsible and careful, I hope, scholarship of some kind. But one of my critics, and I'm saying mine just because it's easier to do it that way because I'm here, this has also been something that Francis Watson from the University of Durham has worked on. I've mentioned Andrew Bernhard as well. But one of my critics, one of our critics, should I say, is a man called Simka Jakubowicz, who is an Emmy Award-winning filmmaker. And he feels very strongly that the Gospel of Jesus' wife is genuine. It's an authentic, original 4th century fragment which demonstrates that Jesus was indeed married to Mary Magdalene. And what Simka does on his website now is he produces videos in which he talks about the problems with people like me. He describes us as C-list scholars in comparison to A-list scholars like Karen King. And he says that what we do is we sit at our blog stations, that's him imitating the blogging, we sit at our blog stations blogging all day in our underpants. So that's his attack on us. Now, why is he so bothered about this? The reason that he's so interested in this issue is that he, in 2007, produced a documentary for Discovery Channel on the Jesus family tomb. He believes that he has discovered the genuine, original family tomb of Jesus. It's in Talpiot in East Jerusalem, and that's a picture of Simka Jakubowicz in the tomb, and it's also a picture of the book that goes along with the documentary. It was a very influential documentary, not least because James Cameron, director of Titanic and of Avatar and films like that, got behind this film, became its executive producer, put some money into the film, introduced it at a big press conference in New York. It was announced as probably one of the most important archaeological discoveries of our time, Jesus' family tomb. Now, you might ask how we could know that a tomb that's been discovered in Jerusalem could be Jesus' own family tomb. The argument runs something like this. The names that are written on the ossuaries that are found in the tomb are simply too extraordinarily similar as a cluster not to be the names of Jesus and his family. In other words, this particular cluster of names that we find in the tomb is remarkable in its similarity to the names that we know of Jesus and his family from antiquity. The tomb itself was discovered in the early 1980s, and it was only very hastily excavated. And so people have known about this for some time. In fact, the BBC ran a documentary on this in 1996, but not much comment was made on it. But when Simply Jakubowicz found out about this, he said, let's call in some statisticians, let's call in lots of people, let's do some DNA tests and so on. And he built up this case for the Jesus family tomb being identical to the Talpiot tomb that's found in East Jerusalem. So the names that you find in the tomb, I've anglicised them here for convenience, are Jesus, son of Joseph, Mariamne, Mary, Joseph, Matthew, and Judah, son of Jesus. All those names are found written on ossuaries, bone boxes, in the tomb. The one that draws Simply Jakubowicz's special attention is the one that he thinks is Mary Magdalene's ossuary, Mary Magdalene's own bone box. And that's a little bit taken from the website. He talks about how this could be a real-life version of the Da Vinci Code. This is like real-life decoders going in and finding out what has actually happened in the first century. This is a picture of the inscription that's on the what he calls the Mary Magdalene ossuary. It's written in Greek, so we're going here from left to right, not from right to left. And you can probably, even if you don't have any Greek, make out at least the first three letters, M-A-R, in English letters, Mar. So what we're looking at is something like Mariamne, Mara. And he interprets this as Mariamne Mara, Mary the Master. It's an honorific title about Mary. And he says, what woman in antiquity would be called Mary the Master? Well, surely this is the kind of thing we might call Mary Magdalene, because she had that very special role in antiquity. One of the difficulties of the claim is that the inscription probably doesn't say what he thinks it says. What it's much more likely to say is this reading from Stephen Fan, which is Mariam Kai Mara. Mary and Mara is probably what it says. And there, traced out in the letters, is the Mariam Kai Mara, Mary and Mara. That's more likely what the piece is actually saying. Now, Simply Jakubowicz tries to make the case, as I mentioned, on the basis of statistics. And of course, the difficulty with the use of statistics is that we often glaze over, don't we? Especially if you're interested in the humanities. Quite often you glaze over when you get to numbers. So what Simply Jakubowicz does is he uses an analogy from the Beatles. So what he says, imagine if, in 2,000 years' time, a certain filmmaker, a certain archaeologist were to discover a tomb in Liverpool, and it had ossuaries, or graves, featuring the names John, Paul and George. He says, now, people would say, well, these are common names, John, Paul and George, it doesn't prove that it's the Beatles. But, he says, If you then found also Ringo, which is a very unusual, distinctive name, how many Ringos do you know? He says, if we were to find a Ringo, then we would say, aha, we've found the tomb of the Beatles. And he says that is what this Mary Magdalene inscription is like. It's like finding Ringo. The difficulty is, we have to remember that the name on that ossuary is not Mary Magdalene. If it was Mary Magdalene, I admit I would be impressed. But it's not. It's Mariam. It's not Mary Magdalene at all. And in fact, even the idea that Simka Jakubowicz presents, that the name is very peculiarly Mary Magdalene's, he can only illustrate by pointing to a 4th century text called the Acts of Philip. So I think the case is a little bit specious. And what I think we have is not John, Paul, George and Ringo. What we have is something more like John, Paul, George, Alan, Martin and Ziggy. That's roughly what we've got in this tomb. And we might well say, well, Martin, that's interesting. Could this be George Martin? Perhaps George Martin was buried with the Beatles. Or we might say Ziggy. Well, that sounds like a 1960s sort of name. Maybe John Lennon and Yoko Ono had a son called Ziggy that we've never heard of before. But we would rightly reject that kind of stuff as special pleading. It wouldn't be the Beatles that we'd found. And actually, incidentally, John Lennon's ashes are not in Liverpool. They're in New York. And George Harrison's, nobody knows where they are. But the one claim is that they were spread on the river Ganges. So if somebody in 2,000 years does find this tomb and claim it's the Beatles' tomb, they would be wrong. See, the reason that the case sounds plausible to many a modern ear is because of the Da Vinci Code. And there's a sleight of hand that's gone on here. What's happened is Simka Jakubowicz has not even discussed the case for Jesus being married to Mary Magdalene. He simply assumes that it would be plausible to find Jesus and Mary in the same tomb together. So when he then sees Judas, son of Jesus, in the tomb, he says, aha, that must be their child. And it isn't the way that you do this kind of history. It doesn't work like that. And there is one video in which he even says that we all know, since the Da Vinci Code, about Jesus and Mary Magdalene and how they were married. But that's the very thing that we need to examine. You might well say, though, that you've heard rumours about Jesus and Mary Magdalene from other places, and it's not simply made up by Dan Brown. And it's certainly the case that Dan Brown has developed the idea of a relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene from actual extant texts. And one of the ones that he's most interested in is the Gospel of Philip, which is one of the Nag Hammadi codices found in Egypt in 1945 that I previously mentioned. It's in Nag Hammadi Codex 2. It's right next to the Gospel of Thomas in that codex. It probably dates from the 3rd century, and it is genuinely interesting when we get to Mary Magdalene, because it describes Mary Magdalene like this. There were 3 who always walked with the Lord, Mary his mother and her sister, and Magdalene, the one who was called his companion. His sister and his mother and his companion were each a Mary. So there, Mary Magdalene is described as Jesus' companion. Koinonos it is here in the Coptic, like the Greek. There's another passage too, where we have, and the companion of the, we're not quite sure what's there, Mary Magdalene, then something else, loved her more than all the other disciples, and used to kiss her often on the, and then there's a lacuna in the text. Isn't it always the way that the lacuna happens at the most interesting piece? And there's all sorts of speculation about what is missing in that piece. The majority view is mouth, that he kissed her often on the mouth. I actually think my suggestion is that the missing word is feet. I don't think that mouth is quite as plausible, because if you're saying you're kissing someone, it's usually taken by default, it's on the mouth. So usually in early Christianity, when they talk about kissing one another, it's assumed it's on the mouth. So if you say frequently on the something, it has to be something a little bit more unusual. The reason why I think feet is a live option is that when you look at any of these early materials connecting Jesus and Mary, feet keep coming into the equation. So I think that it's quite likely that that is what is going on here, and I'll return to that again in a little bit. Now, scholars have got interested in texts like the Gospel of Philip, just as they got interested in the Gospel of Thomas and so on, because of the seminal work of one particular scholar, and that's Elaine Pagels, pictured here. Her Gnostic Gospels in 1979 really got scholars paying serious attention to non-canonical texts for the first time. And as a result of that interest, from the 1980s onwards, people started noticing one text in particular that was really, really interesting, the Gospel of Mary. And people started talking about the Gospel of Mary, looking at other texts for references to Mary, and all of this came out of this movement that Elaine Pagels pushed to get people thinking, not just with their canonical bias, but to think about other early Christian texts as well. And there's been a flurry of books over the last 20 years or so about Mary Magdalene. Here's just a few of them. The Resurrection of Mary Magdalene by James Schaberg, Mary Magdalene Beyond the Myth by Esther de Boer, The Gospel of Mary Magdalene by Karen King, Beloved Disciple, The Misunderstood Legacy of Mary Magdalene by Robin Griffith-Jones. And that's just a few of them. I could have put another 7 or 8 on this slide, books looking into the legacy of Mary Magdalene, especially because of the Gospel of Mary, which was very key in a lot of this writing. That's a piece of the Gospel of Mary. Unlike the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary is not found amongst the Nag Hammadi tractates. It has a separate provenance, and we actually have 3 separate witnesses to it. We've got one in Coptic, which is the one we just heard the quotations from, and we've got 2 Greek fragments as well. So it's well attested in antiquity. Amazingly, there is no reference to it in any ancient text. No one talks about the Gospel of Mary in other ancient texts. Now, what's curious about the whole thing that's happening here is that there is a sea change within the last generation or so. For many years, there was not even a suggestion that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married. If it was talked about, the relationship, it was talked about as a possible relationship of some other kind. In the last temptation of Christ, it's something that happens in Jesus' mind, as I've said. But notice that in the last temptation of Christ, it is simply taken for granted that Mary Magdalene is a prostitute. The same thing is true in 2004, The Passion of the Christ, where Monica Bellucci plays Mary Magdalene, and in this film she is harmonised with the woman from John chapter 8, the woman taken in adultery. Very common move in Jesus' films. You harmonise the sinful woman of Luke 7, the woman taken in adultery in John 8, and Mary Magdalene, and put them all into one character. Sometimes even the Samaritan woman at the well becomes Mary Magdalene too. But these women all become the one, and Mary Magdalene was always a prostitute. One of the things that all of those books that I've talked about have been at pains to stress is Mary Magdalene was not a prostitute. This is the resurrection that they're talking about, beyond the myth. Because there isn't anything in the New Testament at all that suggests that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. And what's happened is, gradually, that scholarly thing about Mary Magdalene not being a prostitute has found its way into popular culture. Gradually it's happened. So that these days, when we hear about Mary Magdalene, it's not about Mary Magdalene the prostitute anymore, it's about Mary Magdalene, Jesus' wife, and so on. But the interesting thing is here, it's not just a case of popular culture influencing scholarship. It's also the case that scholarship is just beginning to push into popular culture and influence that too. So whereas we have Barbara Hershey playing Mary Magdalene as a prostitute in Last Temptation of Christ, Monica Bellucci playing Mary Magdalene as a prostitute in Passion of the Christ, in a couple of more recent films we have Mary Magdalene no longer a prostitute. The Passion, which is a BBC HBO co-production from 2008, has Paloma Biza playing Mary Magdalene when she's clearly not a prostitute. And modesty should prevent me from saying that I had a role in this, but it doesn't, so I'll tell you. I was a historical consultant on this programme, and I said to the producer, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could be the first production ever, not to make Mary Magdalene a prostitute. And after a while, the discussions went on. They said, yeah, let's do it. So she was cast, and she's not a prostitute in it. The rather amusing sideline to that is that the writer Frank Deasy felt the story did need a repentant prostitute, so he does have one in the story, and she's called Mona. There's a new character, a new repentant prostitute, but at least we have Mary Magdalene, not the prostitute. And I'm not allowed to tell you anything about this because I've signed a confidentiality agreement about it, but I can draw your attention to material that's already on the web. But this is the Bible, which comes out in March this year. It's on the History Channel in the US. I'm one of a lot of consultants on this. There's lots of consultants on this, so I doubt that I can take any special credit, although I did actually suggest to them that it would be wonderful if Mary Magdalene, again, was not a prostitute. This is Amber Rose Reaver, who plays Mary in the 10-part series. But I can't tell you anything about it, and you'll just have to wait until it actually comes out. But I think in both those cases, what you're seeing is a small way in which the scholarship, which insists that Mary Magdalene was not a prostitute, is now finding its way into the popular culture. And I think it's a kind of welcome turnaround from popular culture influencing the scholarship. But all of this, of course, just raises the question, who was Mary Magdalene, and was Jesus married to her? Now, one of the issues at hand here is that there's something called the Matthew effect. The Matthew effect is where a particular character becomes ever more popular, and by virtue of becoming ever more popular, becomes more popular still. It comes from the saying in Matthew's Gospel, to the one that has, more will be given, but to the one who has not, even what they have will be taken away from them. And one of the great ironies about the title The Matthew Effect, which was coined by sociologists, is that the term itself is an illustration of the Matthew Effect, because that saying occurs for the first time in Mark's Gospel. So Matthew is all the more popular. Now, there is also... So the Matthew Effect here is, we could relabel it the Magdalene Effect, or the Magdalene Effect, because there are lots of women mentioned in the Gospels, and for some reason we consistently boil this all down to just the one woman, Mary Magdalene. So take the first mention of Mary Magdalene in the Gospels, Luke chapter 8, verses 1 to 3. She's one of three women, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, wife of Chuza, and Susanna, none of whom ever get books written about them. Have you read any books on Joanna, wife of Chuza, or Susanna? Have you read any books suggesting that Jesus was married to them? Not at all. They just vanish into the unknown. Or we look at Mark chapter 15, 40 to 41, which is another mention of Mary Magdalene. She's mentioned alongside Mary of James and Joseph and Salome. We don't even know who Mary of James and Joseph is. She could be Jesus' mother. Jesus' mother, Mary, has two sons called James and Joseph. Could be the same person. It might not, because some people say if it is Jesus' mother, why doesn't Mark say so? And Salome, we don't know who she is. Is she Jesus' sister? Is she another person that travelled with him? We simply don't know who she is. Or we look at John 19:25, in which Mary Magdalene is not even the head of the list. Here we have the mother of Jesus, her sister Mary of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. Incidentally, if you can still remember your way back to when I looked at the Gospel of Philip, my theory is that this is the source of the saying in the Gospel of Philip about the three Marys that walked with Jesus. Because the Gospel of Philip says, the three Marys who walked with Jesus were his mother, her sister, and his companion, the Magdalene. The same order here in John 19:25, the mother of Jesus, her sister, and Mary Magdalene. I think that's the source of the Gospel of Philip saying. The Gospel of Philip is fascinated by the idea of three separate Marys all travelling together, and that's why he mentions them in that order. The reason that Mary Magdalene becomes the central figure in reflections about women in early Christianity, though, is down to the fourth Gospel. It's down to John's Gospel. And it's because in John chapter 20, she's the woman that has that vision of Jesus, that first Easter morning vision of Jesus. And the interesting thing about John 20 is if you read it carefully, it's clear that she isn't the only person present. although John likes to boil things down to one key character, he likes these one-to-one encounters in John's Gospel, but nevertheless, he knows there's other women present because he says, we don't know where they've put him. It's just a little inadvertent Johannine nod to the fact that there were other women present. I think he knows something like the synoptic narrative in which you've got more than one Mary present. Now, one of the issues that is related to this, to the business of Mary Magdalene becoming ever more and more popular, is that in the act of stressing the importance of Mary Magdalene, we are marginalising another famous Mary, Mary of Bethany. Now, Mary of Bethany, the sister of Martha, appears in a famous story in Luke chapter 10, and then she features throughout John 11 and 12. And this Mary is very often the person, I would argue, who is talked about in other early Christian texts. One of the reasons being the feet. Mary, the sister of Martha, Mary from Bethany, is always depicted at Jesus' feet. It's there in Luke 10, it's there in John 11 and 12. And then in these early Christian texts, we have this character, Mary, who adores Jesus' feet. One example is a text called Pistis Sophia. Now, when Mary heard the Saviour speak these words, she exulted greatly, she came before Jesus, she fell down before him, adored his feet, and said to him, "My Lord, listen to me, that I may question you on this word." Regularly, the character that you see in early Christian texts isn't Mary Magdalene, it's Mary of Bethany. But because of our obsession with Mary Magdalene, we are marginalising this Mary. But you might say, well, isn't she called Mary Magdalene in these texts? Well, Karen King's book is called The Gospel of Mary of Magdala. That's the title of the book. Is the text called The Gospel of Mary of Magdala? No, it's called The Gospel of Mary. Magdalene doesn't occur anywhere in the extant text that we have. She's simply called Mary. She's a kind of composite character, a Gnostic Mary that draws in elements from Mary Magdalene, but also elements from other Marys, and especially Mary of Bethany. And one of the curious things is that if you imagine that the ancients weren't like us, and instead of stressing, when we teach our courses on the Gospels, one of the things we do is we say, you mustn't harmonise texts. You mustn't harmonise Matthew, Mark and Luke and John. And we spend ages telling our students to look at the synopsis, to see Matthew for Matthew and John for John and so on. And we say, don't harmonise the texts. But of course, the ancients hadn't had that memo. And in the 2nd and 3rd and the 4th century, they were all the time looking to harmonise. They were looking to find ways of joining these characters together. So one of the things you find in a text like Pistis Sophia that I was just referring to is that the woman who is called Mary Magdalene has a sister called Martha. It's very clearly a composite character. And you will also find in lots of these texts that they did draw some kind of inspiration from Luke chapter 7, the story of the sinful woman. The very thing which we're always telling our students never happened. Actually, you can see elements of that story finding their way into these depictions of Mary. The reason is simple, they were harmonising. John chapter 12 has Mary of Bethany anointing Jesus' feet, crying, wiping them with her hair, which is exactly what the woman in Luke chapter 7 does. So what a lot of the early authors did is they aligned the sinful woman of Luke 7 with Mary of Bethany, with Mary Magdalene. So all of these characters come together into one composite. So, sadly, what we don't have, I don't think, is ancient evidence for Jesus having a wife. Still less do we have any evidence that Jesus' wife was called Mary Magdalene. What we have is a text, lots of texts, in which the different Marys are drawn together into one as a sort of ideal disciple, as an ideal Christian character. And although there's lots to enjoy about that when we look at 2nd and 3rd century texts, one of the things that we need to remind ourselves when we come to the 1st century, when we look at the historical Jesus, when we look at the historical Mary Magdalene, is that a lot of the time we simply don't know what the case was. There are missing pieces in our evidence. And however much we might wish that we could find those missing pieces, we must be careful not to project our own desires, some of them which come from our immersion in popular culture, onto the scholarship itself. Thanks.
Well, thanks for listening to the latest episode of the NT Pod. It was recorded at the University of Birmingham in January of 2013. Thanks to Steve Ray for doing the audio. Thank you to the Department of Theology and Religion at the University of Birmingham for the invitation, and thank you for listening along. You can find me on the web at podacre.blogspot.com. You can Google for me, Goodacre, or Google for NT Pod. You'll find a Facebook page for NT Pod, and you'll find us on Duke University's iTunes U. I look forward to being with you again soon for more normal length episodes of the NT Pod, but thanks again for your company today. Bye-bye.